####1. The property plat from the county records office showed the section line ending at a cluster of granite outcroppings. On the ground, Elias Thorne saw the surveyor's stake, a thin piece of rebar capped in faded orange plastic, driven into the earth a full 50 yards short of the rock. The land, 160 acres of high desert scrub in eastern Washington, had been described in the auction listing as geologically unremarkable. He'd paid less for it than he had for the truck he used to get there. It was a purchase born of a need for emptiness, a place where the silence was his own. He checked the coordinates on his handheld GPS. The stake was correct. The map, printed from a digital file less than a month ago, was wrong. It was the third such discrepancy he'd found in as many weeks. Small things. A fence line that wasn't on the deed but was clearly 30 years old, its cedar posts silvered with age. A well, marked as capped on the schematics, that he'd found open, its steel lid resting in the sagebrush beside it. He had lowered a weighted line into the shaft and felt it run out at a depth that made no sense for a simple agricultural well. He'd noted the depth, 412 feet, in the small, grid-lined notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He logged the mismatched survey marker now. SE corner, marker versus plat, variance 51 yards W. He didn't reflect on it, not yet. He just recorded the fact. The facts were manageable. His hands, calloused from a life spent designing foundations and retaining walls, felt steady as he worked the soil sampler. The auger bit into the dry ground with a gritty protest. He was supposed to be retired. Clara had imagined something different for them. A small cottage on the coast, walking the dog on a wet beach, the smell of salt and wood smoke. He could still see her face, pale against the hospital pillows, her voice a thin, frayed wire. "You need a project, Eli," she had said, her own project of living having been reduced to a series of sterile, timed procedures. Just not too big. This land was his project. It was vast but simple, or it was supposed to be. He extracted the core sample, sliding the tube of earth onto a plastic sheet. He crumbled the soil between his thumb and forefinger. Loam, sand, a high concentration of volcanic ash, normal for the region. He was cataloging the soil composition quadrant by quadrant, a methodical grid laid over the unruly landscape. It was a way to possess the place, to understand it in a way that couldn't be taken from him. It was a way to not think about the sterile smell of the ICU, the quiet beep of a machine that measured a life in blips and lines, the final, unbroken tone. The sun was low, casting the landscape in muted shades of ochre and violet. The air grew cold quickly. He packed his tools, the metallic click of the latches on his case unnaturally loud in the stillness. Back at the small, prefabricated cabin he had delivered to the site, he turned on the generator. The single fluorescent bulb in the main room buzzed to life, washing the plywood walls in a flat, blank light. He made coffee on a propane stove, the water drawn from a tank, not the strange, deep well. He hadn't trusted the well water since he'd had it tested. The lab report had come back with a list of trace elements that the technician called anomalous, not toxic. The man had stressed just unusual. Elevated levels of lithium, traces of cobalt-60 so faint as to be statistically insignificant but present nonetheless. The technician had assumed it was a flaw in his equipment, a ghost reading. Elias had paid the bill and folded the report, placing it in a folder with the deed and the inaccurate map. He sat at his small table, the notebook open beside him. He wasn't looking for anything. That was what he told himself. He was just observing. But the observations were beginning to form a pattern, a quiet counter-narrative to the official story of this worthless piece of land. A variance in a map, a fence that shouldn't exist, a well that was too deep and its water too strange. Each was a loose thread. Alone, they were nothing. He knew from his work as an engineer that systems fail in small ways before they collapse. A hairline crack in a concrete support, a bolt torqued a few pounds too light, a subtle shift in the subsoil. People called them accidents. They weren't. They were a series of unheeded warnings. He paused, his pen hovering over the page. He drew a line connecting the location of the misplaced survey marker to the deep well. Then he drew another line from the well to the phantom fence line. The lines formed a triangle, enclosing a section of land at the property's center. It looked deliberate. He closed the notebook. The single bulb overhead continued its steady, low hum. Outside, the immense, silent dark of the basin pressed in from all sides. For the first time since he'd arrived, the emptiness felt less like a comfort and more like a carefully constructed facade. ####2. The anomaly that broke his restraint was not a line on a map but a piece of metal. 2 weeks later, he decided to clear a flat area for a small workshop, a place to store his tools out of the weather. The work was hard, physical, a welcome distraction. He was using a rented mini-excavator, the diesel engine a low thrum against the silence. The bucket scraped against something that was not rock. It made a high, ringing sound that vibrated up the hydraulic arms. He stopped the engine. The sudden quiet was absolute. He knelt in the shallow trench. The object was a flat plate of steel, about 2 feet square, its surface pitted with rust. But as he brushed away the compacted dirt, he saw the edges were cleanly machined. Bolted to its center was a housing with a thick, glass lens, like an oversized runway light, angled slightly upward. A heavy, insulated cable, thick as his wrist, snaked away from the housing and disappeared into the earth, heading toward the center of the triangle he had drawn in his notebook. He followed it for a few feet, digging with a spade. It was buried in a conduit of some kind, protected. This was not agricultural hardware. It wasn't a septic tank lid or a piece of abandoned farm equipment. It was industrial. It was infrastructure. He spent the rest of the day tracing the path of the cable. It ran perfectly straight for 70 yards before terminating at a concrete slab barely visible beneath a thin layer of soil and scrub. The slab was 10 feet by 10 feet, perfectly square. There were no markings on it, no hatch, no handle, just a smooth, blank surface. He checked its position on his GPS. It was the geometric center of the triangle formed by the well, the fence, and the survey marker. The precision was unnerving. He sat on the edge of the slab, the cold of the concrete seeping through his jeans. He thought of Clara, of their last conversation that wasn't about medication or pain. They were watching a documentary about deep-sea exploration. She had been fascinated by the remotely operated vehicles, the way they moved through the crushing dark, their small lights illuminating creatures that had never seen the sun. "Imagine building something so perfect," she'd whispered, her breath shallow, "that it can survive where nothing else can." He looked at the concrete beneath him. This was built to survive. It was built to contain something or to hide it. His quiet routine was fractured. The methodical work of cataloging the land now felt aimless. The real story was under his feet. The next morning, he drove the 2 hours to the county seat, a town clinging to a river and a history of federal projects. A dam, a weapons depot, a nuclear reservation an hour's drive to the south. The county records office was in the basement of the courthouse, a warren of low ceilings and buzzing fluorescent lights. The air smelled of old paper and dust. He asked the clerk for the historical property records for his parcel. The woman, who looked to be in her late 50s with tired eyes and a tightly controlled perm, slid a form across the counter. "Parcel number," she said, her voice flat. He gave it to her. She typed it into an old terminal, the keys clacking loudly. She paused, her eyes fixed on the green text. She typed the number again. "That's odd," she murmured. "What is?" Elias asked, keeping his voice neutral. "The digital file only goes back to 1991. That's when the parcel was sold at public auction. Before that," she trailed off, tapping a key. "The pre-1991 records are restricted. Says here they're in the Federal Archive." "Why would they be in the Federal Archive?" She shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both ignorance and a profound lack of interest. "Government owned the land, I suppose. Department of the Interior, maybe, or Defense. They owned a lot of this territory during the Cold War."
Buffer zone, test site.
Most of it was remediated and sold off in the 90s. She looked at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "It was deemed clean. The government guaranteed it. He noted the careful phrasing. Not it was clean, but it was deemed clean. There was a difference. An engineer knew the difference between a calculated risk and a confirmed safety. Is there a record of who owned it? Which department?
No.
It just says U.S. government access to the hard copy files requires a formal request. And a reason. She slid the form back to him. You need to state your purpose. He looked at the blank line on the form. What was his purpose? Curiosity? Suspicion? A dead wife and too much time on my hands? He wrote, to verify historical survey boundaries for agricultural development. It was a plausible lie. She took the form without reading it. It'll be 6 to 8 weeks. If they approve it, she turned away, a clear dismissal. He walked out into the thin afternoon light, the hum of the fluorescent bulbs still in his ears. The system had revealed its first wall. A locked file, a waiting period, a demand for a reason. It was designed to exhaust people, to make them give up and walk away. He drove back to his land not with frustration, but with a cold, sharpening focus. The feeling was disturbingly familiar. It was the same feeling he'd had years ago, on a bridge project in South America. He had seen a flaw in the steel sourcing, a discrepancy in the metallurgical reports. He had raised it with his superiors. He had been told to sign off on it anyway. The project was behind schedule, the budget was tight, and the local officials had been paid. He had argued, then been warned. He had a young family, career. He had signed the report. A year later, during a seasonal flood, a support girder had buckled. 17 people died. The failure was blamed on the flood, an act of God. He knew it wasn't. He had the original, flawed report locked in a safe deposit box, a useless monument to his own cowardice. He had lived with that silence for 20 years. He got out of his truck and looked at the concrete slab. This time, he would not walk away. He would follow the thread, no matter where it led. ####3. Elias began his investigation not with a shovel, but with a modem. The satellite internet he'd installed was slow, prone to dropping out when clouds gathered over the distant mountains, but it was a link. He started with the basics, declassified project databases from the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, and the USGS. He spent his nights in the buzzing glow of his laptop, searching for keywords connected to his parcel. Lithium, cobalt-60, deep earth telemetry, geological survey, site WA74B, the designation he'd found stamped on the back of the rebar survey marker after cleaning off the rust and grime. Most searches were dead ends, returning thousands of pages of irrelevant technical documents or nothing at all. But the persistence that had made him a good engineer served him now. He learned to think in the language of bureaucracy, to look for the gaps in the record, the places where information should have been. He found a 1987 Department of Energy budget appendix that listed a line item for geophysical containment studies, with a location simply marked Columbia Basin. The funding was redacted. A footnote mentioned a subcontract with a company called Geodyne Systems. The company, he discovered, had dissolved in 1992, its assets acquired by a larger defense conglomerate. All of its public records had been archived or destroyed. He retraced his steps, searching for Geodyne Systems instead. He found a cached version of a rudimentary website from the late 1990s, a digital ghost. On a former employee's page, he found a list of names. No contact information, just names. He began cross-referencing them with public records, social media, and professional networking sites. It was slow, painstaking work. Most were dead, retired, or otherwise impossible to find. But one name, Anya Sharma, led to a profile on a public-facing government employee database. She was currently a mid-level administrator at the Bonneville Power Administration, the federal agency that managed the region's hydroelectric dams. Her work history listed a position from 1986 to 1990. Project analyst? Geodyne Systems. He drove to the BPA headquarters in Portland, a glass and steel tower that felt a world away from his dusty acreage. He didn't have a plan, just a need to see a face, to connect a name to a person. He sat in the public lobby for 2 hours, watching employees scan their badges through the security turnstiles. He had a photograph from Anya Sharma's online profile. He was about to give up when he saw her. She was older than in the photo, her hair now streaked with gray, but it was her. She moved with a brisk, efficient clip, her eyes focused, a woman who knew her destination. She carried a thin leather briefcase. She didn't look like someone who held secrets, but Elias knew that no one ever did. He didn't approach her. He just watched her disappear into an elevator. The next day, he called the BPA's public information line and asked for her, using the pretext of being an independent researcher looking into historical energy projects. He was routed to her voicemail. He left a message, keeping his voice calm and professional, mentioning geodyne systems and the Columbia Basin. He didn't expect a reply. 3 days later, his phone rang. It was an unlisted number. "This is Anya Sharma," the voice said. It was crisp, controlled. "You called about geodyne." "I did," Elias said, his heart rate quickening. "I'm a landowner near." He gave the rough coordinates. "I found some artifacts on my property from that era. I'm trying to understand what they are." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He could hear the faint, sterile hum of an office. "There's nothing to understand," she said finally. "It was a survey project. Site evaluation. It was terminated. The land was remediated according to federal standards and sold." Her words were a perfect echo of the county clerk's. It was a script. "The remediation seems to have missed a few things," Elias said. "A deep well, buried equipment, a concrete bunker." He added the last word as a probe and escalation. Another silence, longer this time. He could almost feel her weighing her options. "You're mistaken," she said, but the certainty in her voice had thinned. "There was no bunker." "Then what is the 10 by 10 concrete slab buried at the center of the survey plot?" He heard her take a sharp, quiet breath. "I can't discuss this on the phone," she said. "We can't discuss this at all. My advice to you, Mr. Thorne, is to stop digging. You own a piece of land. Enjoy the view. Don't go looking for things." "What if I've already found them?" "Then you should forget them," she said, and the line went dead. The call was a confirmation. Her denial was more potent than any admission. He had touched a nerve, and the system, through her, was beginning to push back. That evening, he went back to the concrete slab. He had brought a sledgehammer from town. The sun was setting, the sky a deep, bruised purple. He stood over the slab, the hammer heavy in his hands. He thought of her voice, the controlled fear behind the professional dismissal. Forget them. He thought of the file in his safe deposit box, the 17 names he had tried to forget for 20 years. He raised the hammer over his head, his arms straining. He brought it down with all his strength. The blow echoed across the basin. A web of fine cracks appeared on the concrete surface. A chip of it flew off, skittering into the dust. It wasn't as thick as he'd feared. He struck it again, and again, the rhythmic, percussive sound a violation of the evening's peace. After 10 minutes of brutal work, a section of the concrete crumbled inward, revealing not a hollow chamber, but a dense matrix of rebar and something else. A thick, black, rubbery material packed around a bundle of conduits. He had broken through the cap. The air that rose from the opening was cool and smelled of ozone and damp earth. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed for a very long time. He shone his flashlight into the hole. He could see wires, dozens of them, and beneath them something else. A metal plate with a stenciled label. The letters were stark white against the dark metal. He angled the light to read them. Test Cell 7. Long-term isotope decay study. Initiated. 1987. Status. Active. ###4. The pushback started quietly. A week after his call with Anya Sharma, a beige sedan with government plates drove up his long gravel driveway. It parked 30 feet from his cabin, and a man in a gray, ill-fitting suit got out. He wasn't armed, or at least not visibly. He didn't look threatening. He looked like an accountant, someone lost on his way to an audit. "Mr. Thorne?" the man asked, his voice soft, reasonable. He didn't offer a hand, just a thin, polite smile. I'm from the Department of Energy's Office of Legacy Management. We received your request for historical files. That was fast, Elias said. I was told 6 to 8 weeks. We try to be efficient, the man said, his eyes scanning the property, noting the excavator, the piled earth near the concrete slab, the general state of deliberate disturbance. We just wanted to follow up in person. Sometimes these requests are clerical errors. It saves everyone time. The implication was clear. Are you sure you want to do this? It wasn't an error, Elias said, his hands in his pockets. He leaned against the frame of his truck, creating a casual barrier. The file you requested pertains to a decommissioned survey site, the man continued, his tone unchanged. As the county records state, the land was environmentally certified and sold. There are no outstanding issues. The project was concluded. The book is closed, so to speak. I found a book someone left behind, Elias said. He decided not to mention the broken slab. Some equipment was buried, not removed. A well that's over 400 feet deep. The man's smile didn't falter. Not uncommon. Sometimes it's more cost-effective and environmentally sound to entomb inert materials than to remove them. It's all perfectly safe. Standard procedure. He paused, his gaze settling on Elias. Felt heavy, evaluative. Our primary concern, Mr. Thorne, is public safety and privacy. The work done on that land, while benign, was subject to certain federal protocols. Digging around can be unpredictable. There are liability issues. We wouldn't want you to get hurt. It was the first hint of a threat, veiled in the language of concern. I'm being careful, Elias said. Good. That's good to hear. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. It was blank except for a name, John Miller, and a phone number with a Washington, D.C. area code. If you find anything else you think is out of place, call me directly. Don't trouble the county. We can clear things up for you much faster. It was an offer to control the flow of information, to redirect his inquiries into a bureaucratic black hole. I'll keep that in mind, Elias said. The man nodded, his purpose served. Enjoy the solitude, Mr. Thorne. It's what this land is for. He got back in his sedan, turned it around in a slow, careful arc, and drove away, leaving a plume of dust that hung in the still air. The visit was an escalation, a shift from passive obstruction to active management. They were watching him. 2 days later, his internet service became unreliable, then failed completely. The satellite company's customer service line was an endless loop of automated menus. When he finally reached a person, they told him his dish was misaligned, a problem on his end. He knew it wasn't. Then his application for the historical files was officially denied. The letter he received was a masterpiece of bureaucratic prose, citing national security exemptions under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. It was a wall of text that said nothing but communicated its message perfectly. Stop asking. He felt a familiar pressure building behind his eyes, the dull ache of helplessness in the face of an unmovable system. He was alone, cut off. His only potential ally had told him to forget what he'd found. The government was now actively engaged in discouraging him. He began to feel the isolation he had once craved as a form of imprisonment. The silence of the landscape no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. He started checking the horizon for the glint of binoculars, listening for the sound of engines in the distance. He retreated into himself, the investigation stalling. He spent a day trying to repair the broken concrete cap on the test cell, mixing new concrete, trying to put the lid back on the secret. It was a pointless, symbolic act. He was trying to undo his own curiosity. As he worked, his hands covered in wet cement, he thought of Clara. He remembered standing by her bedside, listening to a doctor explain, with detached compassion, that the experimental treatment had failed. The doctor had used phrases like unforeseen complications and statistical outliers. He had presented the failure as a blameless, sterile fact. Elias hadn't questioned him. He had just nodded, accepting the verdict of the cold, rational system that had promised a cure and delivered only an orderly death. He had failed to push back then, failed to demand more, to fight for the one thing that mattered. He looked at his hands, at the gray concrete smudged on his skin. He was doing it again, backing down, accepting the official story, letting the men in suits tell him what was safe, what was concluded, what was best forgotten. The anger that rose in him was cold and quiet. It wasn't a hot flash of rage, but a slow, hardening resolve. He stood up, leaving the half-mended slab. He washed the cement from his hands. They could deny his requests, they could cut his internet, they could send polite, threatening men to his door. But they couldn't stop him from digging. He now knew he was not just uncovering a secret buried in the dirt. He was excavating a part of himself he had buried 20 years ago. The part of him that should have said no. ####5. The doubt began to creep in at night. In the profound, unnerving silence of the high desert, his own thoughts became loud. Was he seeing a conspiracy where there was only bureaucratic incompetence? Was he a grieving man, unmoored by loss, creating a mystery to give his empty days a purpose? He would lie on his narrow cot, the generator shut down for the night, and stare into the darkness. The image of the stenciled words, Test Cell 7, active, would burn behind his eyelids. Then it would dissolve into the memory of Clara's face, her skin almost translucent in the low light of the hospital room. He replayed the conversation with John Miller, the man from the DOE. His words had been so reasonable. It's all perfectly safe. Standard procedure. Maybe it was. Maybe he had broken into a sealed, benign experiment, a harmless relic of the Cold War, and was now risking legal trouble for nothing. He could be charged with trespassing on a federal site, even if he owned the land above it. Destruction of government property. The system he was prodding had long, patient arms, could crush him quietly without a sound. His sanity felt like a fragile thing. He started talking to himself, running through the facts out loud as if to convince a skeptical jury. The map is wrong. The well is too deep. The water is anomalous. The fence doesn't exist on the plat. The cable leads to the slab. The slab is labeled. Anya Sharma was scared. He would list them like a catechism, a defense against the encroaching irrationality. The memories of the bridge collapse became more vivid, more insistent. He remembered the face of his direct superior, a man named Henderson, when Elias had brought him the flawed metallurgical report. Henderson hadn't even looked at it. He'd been staring out the window of the site office at the half-finished bridge shimmering in the tropical heat. "Eli," he'd said, his voice weary, "every project has compromises. You know that. We have a deadline. We have a budget. This bridge is going to lift 1,000 families out of poverty. Are you going to stand in the way of that because of a fractional deviation in a steel girder's tensile strength?" It had been a masterful reframing. Henderson had made Elias's legitimate safety concerns sound like selfish pedantry. He'd made compliance feel like the moral choice. Elias had yielded. He had put the report away and signed the approval forms. When the bridge failed, Henderson had been promoted. Elias had been given a bonus for finishing the project under budget and transferred to a desk job in the States. He had taken the promotion, taken the money, and buried the guilt. He had used it to build a comfortable life for Clara, a life that had ended in a room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. Was he doing it again? Was this land another fractional deviation? Was he obsessing over a detail while missing the bigger picture? The bigger picture was that he was alone, vulnerable, and poking a bear he couldn't hope to fight. One evening, driven by a wave of this internal fracture, he packed a small bag. He would leave. He would go to the coast like Clara had wanted. He would sell the land back to the government for $1 if they'd take it. He would forget the slab, the well, the files. He started his truck, the engine turning over in the cold air. He put it in gear and drove to the end of his driveway. He sat there for a long time, his hand on the gearshift, looking at the public road that led away from this place. But he couldn't do it. Turning away felt like a repetition of his greatest failure. It felt like leaving Clara's bedside, like signing Henderson's form. It was a surrender. The quiet patriot in him, the part that believed in accountability, in the simple, hard facts of engineering and ethics, wouldn't let him go. This wasn't about a conspiracy. It wasn't about money or government secrets. It was about a single, unresolved fact. The label on the test cell said active. If it was active, it was consuming power. It was generating data. It was doing something. And he had a right to know what was happening on the land he owned. He put the truck in reverse and drove back to the cabin. The conflict hadn't been resolved, but a decision had been made. He was no longer just a man with a grievance. He was a man with a purpose. He accepted the possibility that he was wrong, even that he was obsessed. But he also accepted that he would see this through to its conclusion, whatever the cost. The next morning, he took a new set of tools to the concrete slab. He had to know what was inside. He began to work on the thick, rubbery seal around the conduits, his movements slow and deliberate. He was no longer just digging in the dirt. He was digging for his own redemption. ####6. He knew he couldn't get into the test cell alone. Breaking the concrete cap was one thing. Accessing the systems within was another. The conduits were bundled and sealed with a black, tar-like substance that was incredibly resilient. He needed help. He needed the reluctant insider. He needed Anya Sharma. Finding her took 2 weeks of patient, careful work. He couldn't risk calling her again. He assumed her phone, like his own life, was now being monitored. He started by looking for a routine. He learned through public transport schedules and a few days of discreet observation from his truck parked near her office building that she took the same light rail train home every evening. On Thursdays, she didn't go straight home. She got off 3 stops early and walked to a small, quiet branch of the public library. He chose a Thursday. The library was nearly empty, smelling of old bindings and floor wax. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. He found her in the nonfiction section, looking at books on horticulture. It was such a normal, domestic interest that it felt jarring. He approached her quietly. "Ms. Sharma." She didn't startle. She turned slowly, her face a blank, controlled mask. She looked at him, then at the book in her hand, then back at him. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Thorne." "You were right," he said, his voice low. "I should have stopped digging." A flicker of something, relief, maybe, crossed her face before she suppressed it. "It's not too late." "It is," he said. "I opened it. The slab. There's a label inside. Test cell 7-inch. Her composure finally cracked. Her hand, holding the book, trembled slightly. She quickly placed it back on the dusty shelf, her movements jerky. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice tight with a fear that was clearly not for him, but for herself. "Nothing yet. I need to know what it is." The label said, "Active." She looked around the empty aisle, at the silent rows of books. "Let's walk," she said. They left the library and walked through the cooling dusk of the city streets. The traffic was a distant river of noise. She didn't speak for several blocks. He just walked beside her, matching her pace. "Geodyne wasn't just a survey company," she began, her eyes fixed on the pavement ahead. "That was a cover. We were a research group under contract with the DOE. The project was called Perennial Fission. The official goal was to study the long-term viability of small-scale, self-sustaining nuclear batteries for deep space probes." Elias paused. "Nuclear batteries. Radioisotope thermoelectric generators," she corrected him, the technical term coming easily to her lips. "RTGs, like the ones on the Voyager probes. They use the heat from the decay of a radioactive isotope, usually plutonium-238, to generate electricity. They can run for decades." They walked on. The confession was coming out in sparse, clinical fragments. "The unofficial goal," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, "was different. This was the late 80s. The Cold War was ending, but no one was sure. There was a theory, a concern, that a first strike could decapitate our command and control. The project was to see if you could bury automated defense systems, retaliatory platforms, things that could lie dormant for 50, 100 years, and then activate on a timer or a signal. They needed a power source that was completely independent, undetectable, and would last a century. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The worthless piece of land he had bought for solitude was a Cold War doomsday installation. So test Cell 7. There were 10 cells, she said, scattered across the West, each one with a different design, a different isotope cocktail. Cell 7 was considered the most ambitious. It used a modified isotope, something they were developing at Hanford. More stable, higher energy density. But it was unstable in other ways. The decay process was not perfectly predictable. It produced byproducts. Like cobalt-60 and lithium? He asked. She stopped walking and looked at him for the first time. Her face, in the muted glow of a streetlight, was etched with a deep, abiding weariness. Yes, among other things, they leach into the groundwater. We knew there was a risk. The containment systems were supposed to be flawless. What happened to the project? The Berlin Wall fell. The budget priorities shifted. Perennial fission was deemed obsolete, a relic. The official order was to decommission and remediate all sites. Most were. The RTGs were removed, the sites cleaned. But a few, the ones with the more experimental designs, were problematic. Removing the core from Cell 7 was considered more dangerous than leaving it in. The risk of a breach during extraction was too high. So, a different decision was made. She started walking again, faster now. They entombed it. They rewrote the records. My boss at Geodyne, a man named Harris, he signed off on it. He called it long-term monitored containment. That's what the active status means. It's not doing anything. It's just being watched. Or it was supposed to be. Watched by who? A small firewalled office within the DOE. Legacy management. They were supposed to monitor the telemetry data from the cell sensors. Check for leaks, for temperature spikes, for seismic shifts. But the budget was cut again and again. The staff was reduced. Harris retired. I left. I think they just forgot about it. It became a line item in a budget, a file in a locked cabinet. An orphan. They had arrived back at the light rail station. A train was approaching, its bell clanging softly. Why are you telling me this? Elias asked. She finally met his gaze directly. The cynicism he had seen before was gone, replaced by a profound guilt. Because I was the analyst who wrote the environmental impact report that said the containment was foolproof. I knew the models had flaws. I raised them with Harris. He told me my job was to analyze the data, not question the project parameters. I was 26 years old. I wanted a career. She looked away. I've spent 30 years hoping the ground wouldn't move. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. It wasn't a document. It was a hand-drawn diagram. This is the wiring schematic for the sensor array access port. It's behind the primary conduit bundle inside the cap. If you can get to it, you can see what the cell is doing. If you see it, you can't unsee it. She pressed the paper into his hand. Her fingers were cold. This is all I can do, she said. Don't contact me again. The train doors hissed open. She stepped inside without looking back. As the train pulled away, Elias stood on the platform, the schematic clutched in his hand. Felt heavier than a piece of paper. It felt like a shared burden, a partial redemption offered by a stranger. The knowledge didn't bring him peace. It brought clarity. The system hadn't just forgotten the test cell. It had chosen to. It had buried its mistake and walked away, leaving a radioactive ghost ticking silently beneath 160 acres of worthless land. ###7. The decision of what to do next settled on him, not in a flash of insight, but as a slow, creeping dawn. He had the truth or a significant piece of it. He held a schematic that was a key to a locked room 30 years old. For 3 days he did nothing. He sat with the knowledge, letting it permeate the quiet corners of his life. He looked out at the land, no longer seeing scrub and rock, but a thin membrane of earth separating him from a miniature, dying sun. He could walk away. He could take Anya's schematic, burn it, and repair the concrete cap on the test cell, making the seal stronger than before. He could live on top of the secret, a silent, knowing guardian. It would be the safe choice. It would be the choice Henderson would have made. It would be the choice he had made 20 years ago, where he could act. But how? Going to the authorities was pointless. He'd already met the authorities. John Miller from Legacy Management was the system designed to contain this very secret. Going to the media felt like a betrayal of the quiet world he had built for himself. He imagined headlines, television crews on his land. His grief and his private crusade turned into a spectacle. The story would be sensationalized, then simplified, then forgotten by the next news cycle. The system would issue a denial, classify the area, and nothing fundamental would change. They would simply build a higher wall. He needed a different kind of action. Not an explosion, but a quiet, precise cut. He needed to create a fact that the system could not easily dismiss or bury. He needed to introduce a piece of irrefutable data into the official record, a piece of data that would force their hand, not in public, but within their own labyrinthine corridors. His plan formed around the sensor array. Anya's schematic showed a small data port, an old RS-232 serial interface, designed for a technician to plug in a diagnostic computer. It was an archaic piece of technology, but one he understood. He spent a day in town gathering the necessary equipment. A vintage laptop from a second-hand store, a serial to USB adapter, a portable power inverter to run it off his truck's battery. The work inside the broken cap was cramped and difficult. He lay on his stomach, reaching into the cold, dark space, the smell of ozone sharp in his nostrils. He carefully cleared the tar-like sealant from the conduit bundle, following Anya's drawing. He found the port exactly where she had said it would be, covered by a small, screw-on metal cap. His fingers, numb with cold, struggled with the cap. When it finally came loose, it felt like opening a tomb. He connected the cable. He booted up the old laptop, its fan whirring noisily in the silence. He ran a simple terminal program. For a moment, nothing happened. Just a blinking cursor on a black screen. He checked the connections, his heart sinking. Had Anya been wrong? Had the system finally died? Then, a stream of text began to scroll up the screen. It was raw telemetry data, a constant, updating feed from the cell's internal sensors. TC_core_temp, 3421K.
Neutron-bas flux, 0012 rem HR. Compte-bas shell-bas int, 9987%.
H2_pressure, 104 atm. GW_sensor_Lee_concentration, 48 ppm. GW_sensor_co 60_count, 18 becquerels per liter. He stared at the numbers. They were the cell's vital signs. Most of them seemed stable, within expected parameters for a decaying RTG. But the last two lines made him freeze.
GW_sensor.
Groundwater sensor. He cross-referenced the numbers with the lab report he'd gotten for his well water months ago. The lithium concentration was 4 times higher than the reading from his well. The cobalt-60 reading, which the lab technician had dismissed as a ghost, was here, undeniable. The test cell was leaking. Slowly, perhaps, minutely, but it was happening. The flawless containment had failed. He let the program run, logging the data to a text file. He sat there for an hour, watching the numbers fluctuate by tiny fractions, a real-time record of the poison seeping into the earth. This was the irrefutable fact. This was the evidence. His decision was made. He wouldn't leak the whole story. He wouldn't talk about doomsday weapons or Cold War secrets. He would use the system's own language against it. He composed a simple, dry email. He addressed it to John Miller at the Department of Energy, and he CC'd the public records officer at the county, the regional director of the EPA, and the head of the state's Department of Ecology. The subject line was groundwater contamination data, parcel hashtag 74B312. The body of the email was brief and clinical. To whom it may concern. Pursuant to my activities on the land I own, parcel hashtag 74B312, I have uncovered what appears to be a buried federal monitoring station. I have accessed the station's diagnostic output and have recorded active telemetry data indicating ongoing groundwater contamination from lithium and cobalt-60. originating from a source on the property. The levels exceed baseline readings for this quadrant. A sample of the raw data log is attached. I am formally notifying you of a potential breach of a contained federal asset and an active environmental hazard. I expect your immediate assessment and a remediation plan as required under federal law. Sincerely, Elias Thorne. He attached the small text file with an hour's worth of telemetry data. He read the email one last time. It was perfect. It was not an accusation, but a notification. It was not a conspiracy theory, but a technical report. It used their language, parcel, quadrant, telemetry, asset, remediation, to create an official record of a problem they could no longer pretend didn't exist. He had forced them to acknowledge their own orphan. He clicked send. The email disappeared into the ether. He disconnected the laptop, sealed the port, and closed the broken cap as best he could. He had acted. He had no idea what would happen, but he had refused to be silent. The choice was made without guarantee of victory or even of a positive outcome. It was simply the choice he had to make. ####8. The aftermath was a study in silence. For 48 hours after he sent the email, nothing happened. The world continued as if he had dropped a stone into an infinitely deep well. There was no reply, no phone call, no beige sedan appearing on the horizon. The quiet on his land became heavy, charged with anticipation. He found himself unable to work, unable to focus. He would just watch the empty road, waiting. The first sign of a response came on the third day. It was not a direct reply, but a ripple in the system he had disturbed. He received an automated email from the county records office. It was a notification that the status of his parcel, #74B312, had been amended. It was now designated as a federal interest property with restricted access. He was still the owner, but his rights were now subordinate to a higher claim. He was, in effect, a tenant on his own land. The next day, a team arrived. They were not from the DOE, or at least their trucks were not marked as such. They were a private environmental engineering firm, the kind of contractor the government uses to maintain plausible deniability. There were 3 trucks and a small drilling rig. A woman in a crisp polo shirt with the company logo approached him. She was polite, professional, and utterly opaque. "Mr. Thorne," she said, handing him a clipboard with a work order. "We're here to conduct a comprehensive geological survey and install a series of groundwater monitoring wells. This is a preliminary step in a multi-phase site assessment." The work order was authorized by the EPA, citing a provision of the Safe Drinking Water Act. His email was not mentioned. The test cell was not mentioned. The project was framed as a proactive, routine environmental survey. The narrative was already being controlled. "How long will this take?" Elias asked. "The initial phase will be 2 to 3 weeks, she said. "We'll need unimpeded access to the property during that time." He watched as they began their work. They were efficient, laying out a precise grid around the test cell. They ignored the cell itself, focusing on the periphery, drilling core samples, and sinking narrow pipes for the monitoring wells. They were mapping the plume, defining the boundaries of the leak he had exposed. They worked with a quiet, detached competence that was chilling. They were not solving a problem. They were managing a liability. John Miller never called. Anya Sharma remained a ghost. The world did not change. There was no article in the paper, no public outrage. His small, precise action had been absorbed by the system, which now moved to quietly cauterize the wound he had opened. It was a strangely hollow victory. He had forced them to act, but the action was on their terms, cloaked in bureaucratic procedure and sealed from public view. He became a spectator on his own land. The constant presence of the survey team, the hum of their generator, the clang of their drill, shattered the solitude he had come here for. He was confined to his cabin, his movements observed. He was an irrelevance to the process he had set in motion. One evening, one of the younger workers, a geologist barely out of college, struck up a brief conversation with him by the fence line. "Weird readings from this site," the young man said, shaking his head. "Never seen cobalt signatures like this outside of a reactor coolant loop. And the lithium, it's off the charts." Makes you wonder what the hell they were doing out here. Does it? Elias asked. The young man shrugged. Not my job to wonder. My job is to log the data. Someone in an office 1,000 miles away will write a report. They'll probably classify it and we'll move on to the next site. He looked at Elias. You're lucky, though. When they're done, they'll have to buy this land from you. Environmental covenant. They can't risk you selling it to some farmer who wants to grow organic vegetables. You'll probably make a decent profit. The irony was acidic. The system's solution was not truth, but money. They would buy his silence, framing it as a real estate transaction. They would bury their mistake under a new layer of contracts and non-disclosure agreements. He had started this to find a form of moral clarity, to correct a past failure. He was ending it as a business negotiation. The world, it seemed, continued on as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted. The leak was now a known fact within the walls of the government. A report would be written. A file would exist. It was not the victory he might have imagined, but it was not nothing. A quiet truth had been entered into the record. It was an echo in a vast, silent hall, but it was there, and it could not be unmade. ####9. The buyout offer arrived 3 months later. It came via a certified letter from a law firm in Seattle he had never heard of, a firm specializing in federal land acquisition. The letter was 5 pages of dense legal language, but the core of it was simple. They offered him 10 times what he had paid for the property. In exchange, he would sign a document transferring the deed to the United States government, and another, much longer document, agreeing to a permanent and binding non-disclosure of any and all activities, observations, or communications related to the land. It was a quiet, efficient erasing. They weren't just buying his land. They were buying his memory of it. He was being paid to forget. The offer was generous. It was a comfortable sum of money that could fund the life on the coast that Clara had wanted. He could take it and walk away. He could declare victory and move on. He spread the documents out on his small table in the cabin. The environmental survey team had left weeks ago, taking their equipment and their noise with them. They had left behind a series of locked and capped monitoring wells, small metal circles in the dirt, silent sentinels standing guard over the buried cell. The land was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a quarantine zone. He thought about the offer. It was the system's final move, its most insidious one. It reframed his moral quest as a financial transaction. It offered him a personal reward for abandoning the public good. It was Henderson's logic all over again. Take the money, sign the papers, and let the problem become someone else's. For a week, he did not reply. He walked the perimeter of his property, the useless fence line that had been his first clue. He looked at the deep well, now capped and sealed by the survey team. He looked at the half-repaired slab, a scar he had made, a wound on the landscape. He had not won. He had simply forced a quiet, powerful entity to acknowledge a flaw in its own vast machine. It had responded not by fixing the machine, but by quietly drawing a curtain around it. He sat in his truck, the engine off, and held the small, cold piece of metal he had kept from the test cell. A fragment of the conduit housing, something he'd pocketed before the survey team arrived. It was a tangible piece of the secret. He thought of Anya Sharma, who had given him the schematic at great personal risk. He thought of the young geologist who believed the truth was just data to be logged. He thought of Clara and her simple, dying wish. Just not too big, he had stumbled into something vast, a project of immense scale and consequence, all because of a small anomaly on a map. He made his decision. He took a pen and signed the land transfer agreement. Then he took the non-disclosure agreement. He read through its clauses, the carefully constructed legal cage designed to ensure his silence. He paused at the final signature line. He folded the document in half, then in half again, and put it in his pocket and signed. He packed his few belongings into his truck. His clothes, his tools, the grid-lined notebook filled with his observations. He left the prefabricated cabin as it was, a ghost house in the middle of a quarantined field. He took one last look around. The land was beautiful in the stark, muted light of dawn. It was also poisoned. He had done what he could. He had not exposed the secret to the world, but he had forced the keepers of the secret to stand guard over it. He had traded his silence for their vigilance. It was an ugly, imperfect compromise. It was the only one available. He drove down the long gravel driveway for the last time. He didn't lock the gate behind him. He left it open, an invitation or a warning, he wasn't sure which. He was leaving the place behind, but he was not the same man who had arrived seeking only emptiness. He was leaving with a purpose he hadn't known he'd lost. He was leaving a system he could not defeat, but had refused to surrender to. He was alone, but he was aware. ####10. He drove west, toward the coast. The high desert basin gave way to pine forests, then to the damp, salt-laced air of the Pacific. He found a small town, a place of rain and fog and the constant, rhythmic sound of the ocean. He rented a small, weathered cottage with a view of the gray water, just as Clara had imagined. He mailed the signed land deed to the lawyers. He did not include the unsigned non-disclosure agreement. He knew they would notice its absence. It was a small, final act of resistance, a loose thread he was leaving for them to worry about. They would likely never pursue it. To do so would be to create a public record, the one thing they sought to avoid. His refusal to sign was a silent, lasting statement. My memory is not for sale. His days fell into a new routine. He walked the beach in the mornings, the wet sand cold under his boots. He watched the fishing boats go out, their engines a low thrum in the fog. The emptiness here was different. It wasn't the watchful silence of the desert. It was a living, breathing quiet filled with the sound of gulls and waves. It was a clean slate. But the past was not gone. It was a residual echo. One afternoon, unpacking the last of his boxes, he found an old photograph of Clara. It was from years ago on a hiking trip in the mountains. She was standing on a granite cliff, smiling, the wind whipping her hair. Behind her, the landscape was immense, wild, and indifferent. He had always loved the photo for her smile, but looking at it now, he saw something else. He saw the complex, hidden systems of the earth she was standing on, the tectonic plates, the slow erosion, the deep geological time. He saw the beauty and the danger inextricably linked. He placed the photograph on the mantelpiece. Beside it, he set the small, metallic fragment from the test cell. It was cold and inert, a piece of a story no one else would ever know. It was a reminder not of his failure on the bridge, but of his choice on the land. He had not fixed the world. He had not brought the powerful to justice. He had only managed to make one small, flawed part of the system accountable to itself. He had not found catharsis, only a quiet, difficult peace. The grief for Clara remained, a space inside him that would never be filled. But it was no longer a void. It was now a source of strength, a memory of a love that had taught him what was worth fighting for. He looked out the window. The tide was coming in, erasing the footprints he had left on the beach. The world continued on, vast and unknowable. But something had been altered. A file now existed in a cabinet in Washington, D.C. that would not have existed otherwise. A team of engineers was now remotely monitoring a dying radioactive core in the high desert. A silent, secret promise was now being kept, all because one man had noticed a line on a map was wrong and had refused to look away. He didn't know if it was enough, but it was something, and for now it would have to be.